Let's get started. Story number 1.
I had never been one to entertain the idea of ghosts or anything supernatural, but that was before I moved into the old Victorian house in the small town of Elmsworth. It was an old, creaky structure with peeling wallpaper, a large garden choked with overgrown ivy, and a history that no one was eager to discuss. It had sat vacant for years, a relic of a past most people tried to forget. I moved in quietly, hoping for some peace and solitude. My life had been complicated recently, and I thought a fresh start in a new town would do me good. The house, though old and somewhat dilapidated, was within my budget, and I thought the charm of its character would make it worth any repairs. The landlord was an elderly man who had lived in town his whole life, and he mentioned the house had been in his family for generations. But he didn't offer much else about its past. There was a certain stiffness in his demeanor when I asked. I settled in, unpacking my boxes and getting used to the space. It was a large house, and the air always seemed thick with dust, no matter how often I cleaned. At night, the house groaned and creaked, but it felt natural, like the building was alive in its own way. I would sit in the living room, staring out the window at the trees swaying in the wind, and I found comfort in the quiet. That peace didn't last long, though. It started small, just a feeling of unease, like someone was watching me. I dismissed it at first, thinking I was just adjusting to the isolation. But then, the strange things began to happen. The first occurrence was subtle. I would hear footsteps when no one was there. It would start with the sound of shoes tapping against the hardwood floors upstairs, followed by the faint rustling of fabric. The footsteps always stopped at the top of the stairs, as if someone was standing there, waiting. I tried to reason it out. Perhaps it was the house settling. It was an old building, after all. But the more I experienced, the less I believed that explanation. There were no drafts, no wind, nothing that would account for the footsteps or the sound of things being moved around. I began to notice other things too. Lights flickering, doors creaking open when I was certain I had shut them, and objects being shifted from where I had left them. The tipping point came one night when I was sitting in the living room reading a book. It was late, well past midnight. The house was silent except for the sound of the wind outside. But then I heard it, a soft whisper like someone was right beside me, speaking my name. I froze, my heart racing. I looked around the room, but there was no one there. I called out, "Hello?" My voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear I was trying to suppress. Silence. I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe it was a trick of the wind, or the house settling again. But the whispering returned the next night, and the night after that. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it felt like a presence, one that wasn't quite human. I tried to ignore it, but the anxiety was building. I had begun to lose sleep, and the unease I felt was growing. I started researching the house's history, hoping to find some logical explanation. The landlord had been tight-lipped about its past, but I managed to find a few old records at the town library. There wasn't much, but I did find a newspaper article from the 1920s that mentioned a tragic event in the house. A woman named Clara Beaumont had lived in the house with her husband, Thomas. They were a well-to-do couple, and the article detailed their social gatherings and the community events they hosted. But there was one mention that caught my eye. Clara had died suddenly in the house, the cause officially listed as a stroke. But neighbors had whispered that her husband Thomas had been abusive. There were rumors that he had been the one to cause her death, though no one had ever proved it. She had been found at the bottom of the staircase, her body twisted in an unnatural way. The details were vague, but it didn't take much to piece together a troubling picture. Clara's death had been a mystery, and some people in town believed it had been no accident. Could this be the presence I was feeling? Was it Clara's spirit, still lingering in the house, trapped by the trauma of her death? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something supernatural was at play. I wasn't sure if it was Clara, but there was something in the house. Something that wasn't willing to leave. A week after reading the article, the activity in the house escalated. One night, I was woken by the sound of a loud crash coming from the kitchen. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs, the beam cutting through the darkness. When I reached the kitchen, I froze. A cabinet door was wide open, and all the dishes inside had been thrown out onto the floor. The plates were shattered, and the kitchen was a mess of broken porcelain. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but when I checked the back door, it was locked, just like I had left it. I spent the next few days trying to make sense of everything. I called a few friends, but no one had any real answers. I considered calling an expert, maybe a paranormal investigator, but wasn't sure I believed in that sort of thing. Then, on a Friday evening, I had the most chilling experience of all. I had just finished dinner and was washing the dishes when I felt a cold breeze sweep through the kitchen. I turned, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadow move across the wall. It was tall, thin, and had an eerie, unnatural presence. My heart raced as I stared at the spot, but there was nothing there. I ran out of the kitchen and back into the living room, where I tried to calm myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. The shadows seemed to dance across the walls, and the house was filled with the sound of creaking wood and whispers. I had reached my breaking point. The next morning, I went to the town's historical society and found more details about Clara's life. According to the records, she had been a lively woman, well-liked by the townsfolk, but her marriage had been a nightmare. She had confided in a friend shortly before her death, saying she was planning to leave her husband. The friend had even offered her a place to stay, but Clara had never made it out of the house. I started to wonder if Clara had never really left. Maybe she was still trying to escape, still reaching out from beyond the grave, trapped by the same oppressive presence that had caused her death. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things and moved out of the house, leaving the landlord with a terse note explaining that I couldn't live there anymore. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had let the history of the house get to me. But deep down, I knew that something in that old Victorian house was real, something dark and lingering, waiting for someone else to take its place. A few months later, I heard that the house had been rented again. I don't know what became of the new tenants, and part of me hopes they never experienced the same things I did. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. The whispers in the dark, or the image of that shadow moving across the wall. And even now, when the wind howls through the trees, I wonder if Clara Beaumont is still wandering those old halls, trapped by the past, waiting for someone to listen. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The small town of Greenville had always been quiet, almost too quiet. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. I had grown up there, surrounded by the familiar faces of neighbors and friends. But when I turned 16, something changed. It started with the house. My family had lived in a charming 2-story house at the end of Maple Street for as long as I could remember. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, with large windows that looked out over the town. It had been in my family for generations, passed down from one relative to the next, and it had always felt like home. My parents had often told me that it was just an old house with its quirks, and it was easy to dismiss the odd creaks and groans of the floorboards as nothing more than the house settling. But one evening, during a particularly stormy night in late October, I began to feel a sense of unease in the house. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the rain lashed against the walls. I was sitting alone in the living room, curled up with a book, trying to block out the storm. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional rumble of thunder. I wasn't sure what drew my attention to the staircase, but I found myself staring at it for what felt like an eternity. The stairs were steep and creaky, leading up to the second floor where the bedrooms were. I had always hated going up there late at night, and for some reason, that night I felt an overwhelming urge to look at them. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint thump, like something had fallen upstairs. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. I waited, straining my ears, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch tapping against the window. But something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The silence stretched on, and I tried to shake the feeling, but I couldn't. I stood up, my legs trembling, and made my way to the bottom of the staircase. I reached out and placed my hand on the railing, feeling its familiar smoothness under my fingers. It should have comforted me, but it didn't. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and began to climb the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight as I ascended, and the sound echoed in the empty hallway at the top. When I reached the landing, I hesitated. The upstairs hallway was dark, save for the faint glow of the moonlight coming through the window. I could see the doors to the bedrooms, but there was something wrong. The air felt thick, heavy, as though something was waiting in the shadows. I moved cautiously down the hallway, my heart racing in my chest. The door to my parents' room was ajar, and I could just make out a sliver of light from the crack. But the room was empty. I turned and made my way to my own room at the end of the hall. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw it. The door to my bedroom was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it before heading downstairs. My pulse quickened as I approached it slowly, my breath shallow and quick. I pushed the door open, and a cold gust of air hit me in the face. My room was exactly as I had left it, nothing out of place. But the air felt different. The room was colder than it should have been, the temperature dropping several degrees. I shivered, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of something unusual. But everything seemed normal. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone was speaking directly behind me. I whirled around, but there was no one there. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The whisper came again, louder this time. It sounded like a woman's voice, though I couldn't make out the words. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. The whispering grew more distinct, and I could feel it. The presence, as if something invisible was standing just behind me, watching me. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I needed to get out of there. I spun around and bolted for the door, but as soon as I reached for the doorknob, it slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me as I banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one came. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, and the coldness in the room seemed to take on a life of its own. I tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and the room fell deathly silent. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, as if waiting for something to happen. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moved, just a flicker in the corner, as if something was shifting in the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, I turned and ran, charging toward the window. I pulled open the curtains and yanked the window open, feeling the cold air rush in. I didn't care that it was a 3-story drop, I just needed to get out. I climbed out onto the windowsill and jumped, landing hard on the ground below. I scrambled to my feet, not bothering to look back, and ran out of the yard, not stopping until I reached the safety of a neighbor's house. They called my parents, and I spent the rest of the night on their couch, too frightened to return home. The next day, I told my parents everything that had happened. They were understandably skeptical, brushing it off as a result of stress or my overactive imagination. But I knew what I had felt, what I had seen. Something in that house had been waiting for me. Something, or someone. A few weeks later, my parents decided to take a trip out of town, leaving me alone in the house for a few days. Despite my fears, I agreed to stay, thinking that maybe it was all just a bad dream at something I had imagined. But as night fell and the house grew quiet, I felt the same unease creeping back. I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the house. I armed myself with a flashlight and made my way upstairs, my nerves on edge. The silence was suffocating, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I reached my bedroom, the door was wide open. The temperature had dropped again, and the room was icy cold. I stepped inside, my breath visible in the air, but this time I wasn't scared. I had to face it. I had to find out what was happening. I stood in the center of the room, waiting, listening, and then it came, the whispering. It was clearer this time, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, soft but urgent. "Help me." I turned toward the sound, my heart racing. The shadow appeared again, this time more defined, moving slowly toward me. I could make out a shape, a figure, faint and indistinct, but definitely there. It was a woman, her face obscured by darkness. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure reached out a hand, and I felt a coldness wash over me. The whispering grew louder. "Help me, please." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't let this go on any longer. I gathered all the courage I had left and whispered, "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure paused, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, with a voice as faint as the wind, the woman answered, "I never left." The air grew thick, and suddenly the room was filled with an overwhelming presence. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. But then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence vanished. The temperature returned to normal, and the whispering stopped. I was left standing alone in the room, heart racing, sweat clinging to my skin. I don't know who or what the woman was, but I haven't been able to forget her. The house has been quiet since that night. My parents sold the place not long after, and I never returned. But I'll never forget the cold hand that reached out to me, the whisper that lingered in the darkness. Whatever it wasn't ready to move on.
Story number 3.
It was the summer of 2012 when my family and I moved into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. My parents had always dreamed of owning a property with land, and when we found this place, they couldn't resist. The house itself was a little rundown with cracked windows and peeling paint, but there was something about it that felt welcoming. The kind of place you could picture yourself growing old in, surrounded by trees and fields. We didn't know much about the history of the house at the time. The previous owners had been a couple who'd lived there for decades, but they'd passed away within a year of each other. No children, no relatives to take over. The real estate agent mentioned that the house had sat empty for several months before we bought it, which was typical for properties in rural areas. The first few weeks in the house were uneventful. My parents were busy renovating and unpacking, while my younger sister, Emma, and I explored the large yard and the nearby woods. The air was always thick with the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers, and we spent most of our time outside, enjoying the peace and quiet that came with country living. It was a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the city life we had left behind. But things started to change around the end of the summer. It began with small things. At night, I would hear footsteps upstairs when I was in the living room watching TV. At first, I chalked it up to the house settling, as older homes often do. But the noises persisted, footsteps that were too distinct to be attributed to settling, soft yet deliberate, as though someone was walking across the floor in the room above. I would go upstairs to check, but there was no one there. The first few times I assumed I was imagining it, but it kept happening. Then, there was the door. The bedroom door in the hallway would open by itself. It wasn't a draft or a faulty latch. I would often find it wide open when I'd swear I had closed it just moments before. It became almost a nightly occurrence, and I couldn't explain it. Emma started noticing things too. One evening, she came rushing downstairs, her face pale. "There's someone in the attic," she said, her voice trembling. She was only 9 at the time, and I knew she had an active imagination, but the look in her eyes was enough to make me pause. I asked her to explain, but she couldn't. She said she'd heard the same footsteps I'd heard earlier, only they were coming from the attic. "I know there's someone up there," she insisted. "I saw them." I didn't believe her, but there was something unsettling about the way she spoke. I went up to the attic to check, and of course, there was nothing. But still, the feeling lingered. It wasn't long before I began to experience more than just strange noises. One night, while I was lying in bed, I saw a figure in the hallway. It was dark, but I could make out the silhouette of a person standing by the stairs. I blinked, thinking it was my mother or father, but when I rubbed my eyes and looked again, the figure was gone. I tried to brush it off, but the unease only grew. The atmosphere in the house started to change. I would walk through the hallway, and the air would feel heavy, thick, like something was watching me. Sometimes I'd hear faint whispering coming from the other room. I would rush in, only to find it empty. Then, one evening, the worst thing happened. I was sitting in the living room, reading, when I heard Emma crying from upstairs. I rushed up to her room and found her sitting in the middle of the bed, clutching her stuffed animal. Her face was red from tears, and her breathing was shallow, like she was scared to speak. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside her. I saw them, she whispered, her voice shaking. There were two people standing by window. They were looking at me. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. The window in her room faced the woods, and there were no neighbors nearby. No one should have been there. What did they look like? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They were old, she said, her eyes wide, and their faces were all wrong. They didn't look like real people. They were just standing there looking at me like they were waiting for something. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I had no idea what to make of it, but I couldn't deny that something was wrong. Something wasn't right about this house. The next few days passed in a blur. My parents were busy with work, and Emma's anxiety seemed to get worse. She was too scared to sleep in her room, so she started sleeping in mine. I couldn't blame her. I had begun to feel a creeping dread every time I entered the house, like something was just beyond my line of sight, waiting for me to notice. One night, I couldn't sleep. The air in my room was thick, suffocating. I kept hearing the faintest scratching sound, like nails running along the floorboards. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't stop. Finally, I gathered the courage to get out of bed and check. The moment I stood up, the room felt freezing cold. I walked over to the door, my heart racing, and when I opened it, I was hit by a wave of frigid air. I crept down the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible. The house was still, silent, except for that damn scratching sound. It was coming from the attic again. My mind raced. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I knew I had to check. I made my way up to the attic, my feet hesitant on the creaky stairs. The attic door was ajar, just a crack, but I could see the shadow of something moving inside. My pulse quickened. I pushed the door open, and I froze. There, standing in the corner of the attic, was a man. At least, he appeared to be a man, but his features were blurred as though I couldn't focus on him completely. His form was flickering, shifting like a shadow in the dim light of the attic. I felt my blood run cold. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a step toward me, and I could feel the air grow colder. My body was frozen, my mind telling me to run, but I couldn't move. "Leave," a voice whispered, low and rasping. It wasn't the voice of a man. It was something else, something ancient, filled with a dark, overwhelming power. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I bolted down the stairs, heart pounding, and slammed the door to the attic shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached Emma's room. I pulled her from her bed, and without a word, I dragged her downstairs. We stayed with neighbors that night, and in the morning, we packed up. My parents didn't ask many questions. They could see the terror on our faces. We left the house, and I never went back. To this day, I don't know what exactly was in that house. All I know is that it wasn't empty. There was something there, something that wasn't going to let go. And as much as I wanted to forget about it, I could never shake the feeling that those figures, those old, twisted people, are still watching from the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I had heard all the stories growing up, whispers in dark corners about haunted houses and restless spirits, but I always chalked them up to imagination or overactive minds. It wasn't until I moved into the old Victorian house on Bellerose Street that I had my own unsettling encounter with something I couldn't explain. The house itself had been on the market for months, which should have been a red flag, but it was perfect for me. It was big, spacious, with a long garden, and best of all, it was affordable, especially given the area. When I moved in, I immediately felt a sense of peace. I'd finally gotten out of the cramped apartment in the city, and the quiet, tree-lined streets of the small town promised a slower pace of life. The first few weeks were nothing out of the ordinary. The house, though old, was well-maintained. The creaking floorboards and the occasional draft were nothing more than the quirks of an older home. I spent most of my time unpacking, getting comfortable, and adjusting to the change in scenery. Then one night, things began to shift. It was a Wednesday evening, a few weeks after I had settled in, and I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that only an old house can have. As I chopped vegetables, I heard a soft thud from upstairs. I froze. It wasn't loud, just a dull noise like something had been dropped on the floor. I figured it was probably the house settling, an old home's usual noises, and continued with my cooking. But then came another noise. This time, it was unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps echoing from above as if someone was walking around upstairs. I froze again, knife still in hand. My mind raced. Was someone in the house? I was certain I had locked all the doors. I walked toward the stairs and paused, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. I didn't move. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. The seconds stretched on, and I tried to convince myself it was just the house. You know, old homes make noises, but the longer I stood there, the more unsettled I became. I finally took a deep breath and began to walk up the stairs. The moment my foot touched the first step, the footsteps resumed, this time louder and closer, as if the person upstairs had heard me and was moving toward the stairs. I froze again, heart pounding in my chest. There was no one in sight, and the air felt colder, much colder than before. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were just above me now, slow and steady, like someone walking around aimlessly. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and a chill ran down my spine. I backed away from the stairs, not knowing what to do. After a few moments, the steps stopped again. The silence returned, and I was left standing there, my heart racing. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, too shaken to sleep. Every creak, every rustle in the house felt amplified. I kept telling myself it was just the house settling, the wind making the floors groan. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That wasn't the sound of an old house settling. It was something else. The next day, I called the real estate agent who had sold me the house, asking if he knew anything about its history. He was hesitant at first, but then admitted that the house had been on the market for a while because of strange occurrences reported by the previous tenants. Some mentioned hearing footsteps and feeling a sense of being watched, but none of them could explain it. The agent assured me it was probably just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. A few nights later, the footsteps returned, but this time they were different. Instead of the slow, measured pace from before, they were frantic, like someone was running back and forth. I felt the air grow colder again, and as I stood in the hallway, I heard a soft whisper. A faint voice, so faint I couldn't make out the words, but it was there, right behind me. I turned around quickly, my breath catching in my throat. No one. The house was empty, and yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I ran downstairs, my pulse hammering in my chest. I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my jacket and left the house, not knowing where I was going, but I couldn't stay in that house anymore. The next morning, I visited the town's library, hoping to learn more about the house's history. The librarian, an older woman with silver hair, seemed to recognize the address right away. She led me to a stack of old newspapers, and as I sifted through the pages, I found a story about the house. It was dated from the 1920s. The article described a tragic event. A woman named Margaret Reed had lived in the house with her 2 young children. According to the report, Margaret had gone missing one night, and her children were found alone in the house, terrified and hungry. It wasn't until weeks later that Margaret's body was discovered in the attic. Her death ruled a suicide. But there were whispers that she had not been alone in her final moments. Some said that she had been visited by a figure in the house, a shadowy presence that no one had ever been able to identify. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was clear that something tragic had happened in the house, but what struck me the most was the mention of the attic. I had never gone up there. In fact, I hadn't even thought about it. But after reading the article, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that attic was connected to what I had been experiencing. That night, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight, my hand shaking as I made my way up to the attic. The stairs creaked under my weight, and when I reached the top, I hesitated. The air was thick and musty, and I could smell the remnants of something old, forgotten. I flicked on the flashlight and scanned the room. At first, it seemed empty. Dust covered every surface, and old furniture was stacked in the corners. But then, my flashlight fell on something near the far wall, an old, faded portrait of a woman. It was a picture of Margaret Reed. As I stared at the photo, something caught my eye. It was a reflection, just a brief glimmer in the flashlight's beam. I turned quickly, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there, just the empty space around me. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath in front of me. I felt a presence behind me, as if someone was standing there, watching me. I turned around, but the room was still empty. I was done. I couldn't take it anymore. I left the attic in a rush, nearly tripping down the stairs in my haste. I didn't even bother to lock the door behind me. I was done with that house. The next morning, I called a moving company and packed up everything I could. I didn't even look back as I left the house, knowing I couldn't stay there for another minute. That was years ago. I never went back to that house, and I never told anyone the full extent of what I experienced. People in town still talk about it, about the house on Bellerose Street that's been empty for years now. I wonder if anyone has ever moved in again, and I wonder if the footsteps still echo through its empty halls. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I grew up in a small town called Briarwood. It wasn't much to look at, just a handful of streets, a few local shops, and a lot of old houses. My family lived in a big Victorian house on the edge of town. It was always a bit too big for just the three of us, and while my parents never admitted it, I could tell they were a little creeped out by the place. It was cold and drafty, and the dark wood floors creaked at the slightest movement. But despite all that, we never moved. I guess it felt like home, even though it wasn't always the most comfortable one. When I was about 12, I began to notice strange things happening around the house. It started off slowly, just little things. A door would be open when I was sure I had closed it. A light would flicker for no reason. Sometimes I would walk past a room and hear what sounded like whispers, but when I checked, no one was there. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the incidents became more frequent and they started to feel deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. The first real incident happened one night when I was home alone. My parents had gone out for the evening and I was sitting in the living room watching TV. The house was quiet and everything felt normal until I heard it, a soft tapping noise coming from upstairs. I paused the show and listened, thinking maybe it was just a branch hitting the window or the house settling. But then the tapping continued, followed by a scraping sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my heart started to race. I stood up slowly, my eyes fixed on the staircase, unsure if I should go up or call my parents. I didn't hear the noise anymore, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I decided to check it out. I made my way upstairs, but when I reached the top, there was nothing. The house was still. I went into my room and tried to shake off the strange feeling, but I couldn't. The silence felt heavy, like something was waiting. I climbed into bed, pulled the covers up to my chin, and tried to fall asleep. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. This time, it was much closer. The unmistakable sound of footsteps walking down the hall toward my door. I froze, holding my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The steps grew louder, closer. The handle of my door jiggled, and then, with a slow creak, it began to open. I pulled the covers tighter around me, too terrified to move. When the door finally opened all the way, there was no one there. I spent the rest of the night on edge, terrified to sleep, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. When my parents came home later, I told them about what had happened. They brushed it off, saying I was probably just imagining things, but I knew what I heard. The following weeks were filled with more strange occurrences. I began to notice that things weren't always where I left them. Objects would be moved, or things I hadn't touched in weeks would suddenly be out in the open. I started to feel like I wasn't alone in the house, even when no one was around. I would walk through the hallways and there would be this overwhelming sense of someone watching me, just out of sight. I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't take me seriously. "It's just an old house," they said. "It's bound to make noises." But I knew it wasn't just noises. I felt it. Something was in the house with us. It wasn't until my sister Lily came to visit that things escalated. Lily was a few years older than me and had always been a little skeptical of my stories. When she came to stay with us for a weekend, I was excited, hoping that having someone else around would make things feel less strange. But the first night she was there, she called me into her room. "Okay, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice low but tense. I keep hearing noises, scratching, footsteps. What is it? I didn't say anything right away. I didn't want to sound crazy, but at the same time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. You hear it too? I asked. Lily nodded, and I could see the same fear in her eyes that I had been feeling for months. It's like someone's walking around in the walls. And I'm telling you, I'm not just hearing things. That night, we both decided to stay awake. We sat in Lily's room, listening to the house. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then, just as I was starting to believe we'd imagined everything, it happened. We both heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving in the hallway outside. Lily's eyes widened, and I could see the same panic rising in her. "What is that?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer, but I was too scared to go out into the hallway alone. So we waited. The footsteps grew closer and closer to her room until we could hear them right outside the door. Then, just as abruptly as they had started, the steps stopped. A cold breeze swept under the door and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Lily and I looked at each other, both terrified, but neither of us brave enough to open the door. It wasn't until morning that we mustered up the courage to investigate. We checked the entire house, but found no signs of anything unusual. No one was there, and nothing had been moved. But the feeling, the coldness, the footsteps lingered. We spent the rest of the weekend in a tense silence, and when Lily left, I felt a strange sense of relief. But things didn't get better. If anything, they got worse. The activity in the house seemed to intensify. It wasn't just the footsteps or objects moving anymore. I began hearing voices, soft murmurs that I couldn't understand, and I would wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, unable to breathe, as if something was holding me down. One night, after what felt like an eternity of sleepless nights, I finally snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and searched for answers, anything that could explain what was happening in the house. That's when I found out the truth. The house had a history, a dark one. It had once belonged to an elderly couple, the Millers. They had lived there for decades, but their deaths had been mysterious. There were whispers that they had died under strange circumstances, their bodies discovered in the house just days after they passed. No one knew what had really happened, and over time, the house became known for its eerie reputation. After reading this, I wasn't sure if I felt more terrified or relieved. The answers were horrifying, but at least I knew I wasn't going crazy. The house was haunted. The Millers weren't ready to leave. I never told my parents what I'd found. They still insisted that everything was just in my head. But after a while, they agreed to sell the house. We moved out within the year. The house still stands, though. The new owners have moved in, and I'm sure they've experienced their own strange occurrences. I hope they get the answers I never did. But as for me, I've never forgotten that house. The footsteps in the dark, the cold that never seemed to go away, and the feeling that something was always watching. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I never thought much about ghosts. Sure, I had heard the usual stories, the ones about haunted houses or restless spirits, but I always assumed they were just that. Stories. That was until I found myself in a small, sleepy town, moving into a house that would change everything I thought I knew. I had recently relocated for work, leaving behind the bustle of the city for the quieter, slower-paced life in a town nestled in the rolling hills. The house I rented was on the outskirts, a stone's throw from the woods, with a wide front yard and an overgrown garden. It had an old charm to it, with tall, narrow windows and a heavy wooden door that creaked every time it was opened. It was perfect, or at least it seemed perfect at first. The first few nights were peaceful. I settled in quickly, enjoying the calm after the chaos of city life. There were no neighbors nearby, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of crickets. But after a few days, I began to notice something strange. It started with the lights. I would come home after work to find the lights in rooms I was sure I had turned off, flickering on. It was easy enough to explain away. Maybe I hadn't switched them off completely, or maybe it was a fault in the wiring. But it didn't stop there. It got worse. One evening, as I sat in the living room, a noise from upstairs caught my attention. It was faint at first, almost like a tapping, but as I listened, it grew louder, more insistent. A soft knocking on the floor, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I froze. staring at the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest. I waited for a few seconds, unsure if I should go check or just ignore it, but the noise didn't stop. It was like someone was walking above me, pacing back and forth. I got up and walked to the base of the stairs, but the house was silent again. No sound, no movement. I chalked it up to the house settling, an old building with its creaks and groans. Maybe the wind had blown something out of place. But even as I tried to rationalize it, a nagging feeling remained, gnawing at me in the pit of my stomach. The next few days passed uneventfully, and I tried to forget about the noises. That was until one night when I was woken from a deep sleep by the distinct sound of someone calling my name. Sarah. I jolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around the dark room, my eyes struggling to adjust. There was no one there. The house was silent once more, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I lay back down, trying to convince myself that it had been a dream, that I was just imagining things. But as I closed my eyes, I felt the unmistakable pressure of someone standing near the bed. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It was like there was something or someone else in the house with me. I went to work, distracted, the image of that dark, empty room lingering in my mind. That evening, I came home to find something strange. The front door was wide open. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. My heart skipped a beat, and I stepped cautiously inside, expecting to find someone lurking in the shadows, but the house was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the door. It was impossible. I locked the door every time. I started locking every window and door, checking them twice before going to bed, but the occurrences didn't stop. I would hear faint whispers in the corners of rooms or catch glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The house, once so inviting, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in on me. I reached out to the landlord, asking about the history of the house. He was evasive, only mentioning that it had been passed down through generations and that the previous tenants had never had any issues. But something about the way he spoke made me uneasy. He didn't want to tell me anything, and that made me more determined to find out the truth. I did some digging of my own. The town was small, and the local library had records of the area's history. As I sifted through old newspaper clippings and town records, I came across a story from decades ago. The house I was living in had once belonged to a family named the Carters. The article detailed a tragic incident that had occurred when the youngest daughter, Emily, had gone missing. According to the report, Emily had wandered off into the woods one evening and never returned. Her body was found days later, deep in the forest, and the circumstances surrounding her death were never fully explained. Her parents were devastated, but it didn't end there. The article mentioned that after Emily's death, strange things began happening in the house. The family reported hearing footsteps, voices, and even objects moving on their own. They eventually left, unable to cope with the growing sense of dread in the house. The Carters' story was just one of several similar reports from families who had lived in the house, all of them claiming to experience unusual phenomena before moving out. I couldn't believe it. The house was haunted. There was no other explanation. That night, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let whatever was in the house drive me out. I had to face it. I had to know what was happening. I waited until midnight when the house was silent. I sat in the living room waiting for the familiar sounds to begin, the footsteps, the whispering. And sure enough, they came. The faint tapping followed by the unmistakable sound of someone walking upstairs. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked toward the stairs. "Emily," I whispered into the dark, hoping that somehow this would make sense. "If you're here, I just want to understand." For a moment, everything was still. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A soft voice, barely a whisper, but clear as day. "Help me." I froze, heart in my throat. The voice sounded so real, so desperate. I could almost feel the cold breath against my ear. Without thinking, I rushed upstairs, following the sound of the voice. As I reached the top of the stairs, the temperature dropped sharply. The air grew thick, like something heavy was pressing down on me. My breath came out in visible puffs as I moved down the hallway toward the last room at the end. The door creaked open slowly, and I stepped inside. The room was empty, but as my flashlight swept across the walls, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the far wall, in faded writing, were the words, "I'm sorry." I gasped, stepping back. The words were scrawled in a shaky hand, the paint peeling and worn. My heart pounded as I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Emily," I whispered again, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. "I'll help you." The temperature in the room seemed to ease, and for the first time since moving in, I didn't feel the overwhelming sense of dread. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence wash over me before turning and walking out of the room. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if Emily's spirit was finally at rest or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But after that, the house was never the same. The footsteps, the whispers, they stopped. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive weight that had hung over me for weeks lifted. I stayed in that house for another few months before I moved on to a different place. But I'll never forget the feeling of that night, the sense that there was something or someone trapped in that house, waiting for someone to listen. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
I grew up in a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and stories of the past clung to the present like ivy to a stone wall. My family lived in an old farmhouse at the edge of the woods, a house that had been passed down for generations. It was a beautiful place with wide porches, creaking floorboards, and an attic that always seemed just a little too dark. When I was 11, my parents decided to renovate the house, updating it while keeping its original charm. They tore out old wallpaper, replaced sagging beams, and planned to open up a sealed room off the second floor that no one had entered in decades. The room, my father explained, had been locked and abandoned sometime in the early 1900s, though no one seemed to remember why. The day they opened the door, I was standing in the hallway, watching. My father pushed it open with a grunt, the old hinges groaning in protest. The air that spilled out was musty and cold, like the inside of an old cellar. Dust danced in the sunlight as we peered inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single wooden bed, a trunk at the foot, and a rocking chair near the window. The wallpaper was faded, peeling in places, but I could make out a delicate floral pattern beneath the grime. "Looks like this was a child's room," my mother said, brushing cobwebs from the chair. "Maybe one of your great aunts or uncles?" I nodded, though I didn't recognize anything from the family stories my grandmother used to tell. There was something about the room that made my skin prickle, though I couldn't explain why. It was just off. My father dismissed it as the smell of decades of neglect and left me to explore while he brought up tools to begin cleaning. The first thing I noticed was the doll. It was sitting in the corner of the bed, its porcelain face chipped and its dress yellowed with age. Its painted eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking, as if it had been waiting for someone to return. Something about it unnerved me, but I told myself I was being silly. It was just a doll. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps above me. My bedroom was directly below the newly opened room, and the sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps crossing the floor. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The house was old, and the creaks and groans were nothing new, but this was different. It sounded like someone pacing back and forth. The next morning I told my parents, but they brushed it off. "Probably just the house settling," my dad said, not looking up from his coffee. "Nothing to worry about." But the noises continued. Every night, just after midnight, I'd hear the footsteps start. Sometimes they were faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. Other times, they were loud enough to make the chandelier in the dining room tremble. I stopped sleeping, lying awake with the blankets pulled up to my chin, waiting for the sounds to start. One evening, as I was helping my mother clear the table, I decided to ask her about the room. "Do you know who lived there before it was sealed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She paused, her hand hovering over a stack of plates. "Not really," she said slowly. "Your grandmother mentioned something once, but I don't remember much. Something about a little girl who got sick and, well, it was a long time ago." The way she trailed off told me she knew more than she was letting on. That night, I went up to the room alone, flashlight in hand. The air felt heavy as I stepped inside, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The doll was still on the bed, its cracked face tilted slightly toward me. I shivered and turned my attention to the trunk. It was locked, but the old metal latch was rusted and weak. I pried it open with a screwdriver, the lid creaking as I lifted it. Inside were a few faded dresses, a pair of scuffed leather shoes, and a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. I pulled out the letters and sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully untying the ribbon. The letters were written in a neat looping script and addressed to Clara. They were short, filled with loving words from a mother to her daughter. The last letter was different. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places as though written in a rush. "Dearest Clara," it began, "I am so sorry for what has happened. I never wanted this for you. I pray you find peace in this house, even if we cannot be here with you. I will always love you." The letter ended abruptly, with no signature. I stared at the paper, my mind racing. Who was Clara, and why had she been left behind? Over the next few days, the activity in the house escalated. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, and doors that had been closed would be wide open when I turned around. One morning, I found the doll sitting in the hallway outside my room, even though I hadn't touched it. My parents were starting to notice too. My mom admitted that she'd heard faint crying coming from upstairs, and my dad swore he'd seen the rocking chair moving on its own. Finally, my grandmother came over to visit. When I mentioned the sealed room, her face paled. "That room should have stayed locked," she said firmly. "That's where Clara died." She went on to explain that Clara had been my great-great-aunt, the youngest of 8 siblings. She'd fallen ill with scarlet fever and had been quarantined in the room to prevent the disease from spreading. Her mother, racked with guilt, had stayed by her side until the end, but after Clara died, the room was sealed and never spoken of again. "She was only 6, my grandmother said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "They say her spirit never left." That night, I had a dream. I was standing in Clara's room, the air thick and cold. The doll was in my arms, its weight heavy and unnatural. A little girl stood by the window, her back to me. Her blonde curls were matted, and her dress hung loosely on her frail frame. She turned slowly, her pale face streaked with tears. "Why did you open the door?" she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. I was safe there. I woke up gasping, my chest tight. The room was freezing, and the doll was sitting on my nightstand, though I hadn't brought it downstairs. I couldn't stay there any longer. I ran to my parents' room and begged them to do something, anything, to make it stop. The next day, my father called a local priest. He came with a kind but serious demeanor, carrying a small vial of holy water and a Bible. He walked through the house, muttering prayers and sprinkling water in every corner. When he reached Clara's room, he paused. "She's still here," he said quietly. "But she's not angry, she's just lonely." He performed a blessing, asking Clara to move on, to find peace. As he spoke, the air in the room seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. After that, the house grew quiet. The footsteps stopped, the shadows faded, and the doll remained where we left it. We sealed the room again, this time with a small plaque on the door that read, "In loving memory of Clara." I never forgot her, though. Even now, decades later, I sometimes dream of her standing by the window, looking out at the woods, and in those dreams, she's smiling. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was the kind of house that could easily have been on a postcard. Charming, with white clapboard siding, a wraparound porch, and ivy creeping up the side. Nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside, the house had been in my family for generations. My parents moved us there when I was a child, and while it was large and beautiful, it always had an eerie feeling about it. As a kid, I never fully understood why the house felt different from others. It wasn't just the drafts that whistled through the cracks in the old windows, or the creaking of the floorboards when you walked across the rooms. No, it was something more subtle, like an underlying hum of presence, as though someone else lived there, unseen, just out of sight. When I was a teenager, I began to experience things that were harder to dismiss. At first, it was small things. My clothes would go missing and then reappear in places I'd never left them. The kitchen lights would flicker late at night, even though no one else was awake. I could never find a clear explanation for it, so I convinced myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps I was simply forgetful. One night after my parents had gone to bed, I was in the kitchen making a late night snack when I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the living room. I thought nothing of it at first. Maybe it was the house groaning under the weight of the wind, but then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't rhythmic or natural. It was hesitant, almost as if someone was gently knocking on the wall. I stood frozen, staring into the dimly lit hallway leading to the living room. It was so quiet that I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Slowly, I set down the bowl of cereal I had been holding and walked toward the source of the noise. The living room was dark, save for the faint light spilling in through the windows. I stepped into the room, scanning every corner, every shadow. There was nothing unusual, yet the air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't quite grasp. "Hello?" I called out softly, my voice trembling. There was no reply. I turned to leave the room, but froze when I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. It was subtle, just a flicker, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The old grandfather clock in the corner of the room, which hadn't worked in years, had just chimed. And not just once, but twice. I hadn't touched it, and no one in the house had wound it. The chimes rang out again, echoing through the quiet house. I couldn't move for a long moment, rooted to the spot by a feeling I couldn't explain. My stomach twisted in a way I'd never felt before, a deep, instinctual fear. Finally, I bolted from the room, running up the stairs to my bedroom. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told my parents about the noises, but they just shrugged it off. "Old houses make strange sounds," my dad said. "It's probably the wind or the house settling." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just beyond my reach, stayed with me. Over the following weeks, strange things continued to happen. The taps would come and go, usually when I was alone. One evening, I came home from school to find a glass of water sitting on the kitchen table, though I hadn't left it there. And sometimes, late at night, I would hear faint whispers coming from the hall outside my bedroom door. I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The house, the noises, the feeling of being watched, they all started to blur together. My parents grew concerned as my behavior changed. I was sleep-deprived, anxious, and irritable. But I couldn't explain what was happening. The house had always been there, but it felt different now. It felt alive in a way I couldn't understand. One evening, after weeks of feeling unnerved, I decided to confront whatever was causing the disturbances. I had heard rumors from some of the older people in town about the house's history, how it had once been a boarding house in the early 1900s, and how a young woman had mysteriously disappeared from one of the rooms. I didn't know whether to believe the stories, but I was desperate for answers. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I took a flashlight and crept down to the basement. The basement, with its stone walls and low ceiling, always felt like the heart of the house's strange energy. It was there that I first felt truly alone, separated from the rest of the world by miles of stone and earth. I had always avoided the basement, but tonight I felt I had no choice. As I descended the stairs, I could hear my breath echoing in the narrow space. The flashlight beam danced across the walls, casting long, eerie shadows. The temperature dropped as I reached the bottom, a chill that crept into my bones and made my skin prickle. I turned the light toward the far corner of the basement, where an old trunk sat, its lid askew. I'd never noticed it before, but something about it drew me in. I approached it slowly, my heart racing in my chest. As I reached down to lift the lid, a cold gust of air blew past me, ruffling my hair. I froze. The air felt heavy, like it had been holding its breath for years. With trembling hands, I opened the trunk. Inside, I found old papers, yellowed with age, and a single photograph. The photo showed a woman in a white dress standing in front of the house. She had dark, intense eyes, and her expression was unreadable. I stared at the picture for what felt like an eternity, unable to tear my eyes away. Then I heard it. The tap. It started as a soft sound, just like the ones I had heard in the living room all those weeks ago. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, it was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Standing at the top of the stairs was the figure of a woman, draped in white, her eyes, dark and sorrowful, locked onto mine. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. She just stood there, staring at me with that empty gaze, and then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished. One moment, she was there, and the next, she was gone. I ran up the stairs, my legs weak and my head spinning. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, my hands trembling as I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. The house had never felt the same after that night. I couldn't stay there any longer, not with the whispers and the tapping that had begun to haunt me every hour of the day. I packed my things and moved in with a friend, leaving my family behind in the house. Years later, I returned to the house, now empty and for sale. I stood in the living room, the memories flooding back. The house had changed, but some things were still the same. The creaky floors, the oppressive silence, and the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. As I stood there, I glanced toward the old grandfather clock in the corner, the one that had chimed on its own all those years ago. To my surprise, the hands were moving, slowly, deliberately. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, I heard it again. A soft tap, tap, tap. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I understood now. The house had its ghosts, its memories, and it wasn't ready to let go of them. It would hold on to them for as long as it could, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, neither would I.
Story number 9.
I had never believed in the paranormal. I was one of those people who scoffed at ghost stories, attributing them to overactive imaginations, or at worst, a desire for attention. But all of that changed the night I moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The house was a fixer-upper, old but full of potential, with a large yard and a few acres of land. I was eager to start fresh. I had just gone through a rough patch in my life and thought moving to the country would be the perfect way to reset. The landlord, a quiet, older man, had warned me that the house was a bit odd and had been vacant for years, but he didn't offer much else. Still, I was undeterred, brushing it off as idle talk. For the first few weeks, the house was exactly what I had hoped for. Peaceful, spacious, and quiet. I spent my days unpacking boxes and sorting through the remnants of my past, and the nights were filled with the soothing sound of wind rustling through the trees. There was something comforting about the isolation. The house itself had a strange beauty to it. Creaky floors, large windows that let in just enough light, and a cozy fireplace in the living room. But soon, I began to notice odd things. It started with small noises at night, footsteps on the floorboards above me when I knew I was the only one home. Sometimes I would hear what sounded like soft whispers, but when I listened closely, they faded away. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the house settling. After all, old houses make noise, right? But then, one evening, I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. I looked around, but the windows were closed, and there was no draft. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the old heating system struggling to keep up with the cool evening air. Still, the feeling lingered, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. Later that night, when I was getting ready for bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of something or someone moving upstairs. I froze in place. I had checked the entire house earlier in the day, and I knew there was no one else there. My mind raced as I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe I had left a window open, or perhaps an animal had found its way inside. But I knew deep down that this wasn't an animal. It was something else. The next day, I asked the landlord about the house's history. He was evasive, saying only that it had been in his family for generations and that it had been vacant for years because no one wanted to live in it. I asked him if anything strange had ever happened there, but he quickly changed the subject, telling me that I was probably just hearing the house settling. I pressed him a bit more, but he was clearly uncomfortable with the topic. It didn't take much for me to realize that there was more to the house than he was letting on. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences grew more frequent and more intense. I began to hear the whispers more clearly, and I started waking up in the middle of the night, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. One night, I woke up to find the light in the hallway flickering. It had been off when I went to bed, but now it was flickering on and off in a way that seemed almost deliberate. I immediately got up to turn it off, but the light wouldn't respond to the switch. It kept flickering, as if someone was playing with it. Then came the night when everything changed. I had been feeling uneasy for days, as though the presence in the house was growing stronger. I was alone in the living room, watching TV, when I heard a loud bang coming from the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat. I slowly got up and walked toward the kitchen, trying to calm myself. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I certainly didn't expect what I saw. The kitchen door was wide open, and the cupboards were swinging open and closed as if something invisible was searching through them. The air was cold, and I could see my breath in front of me. I stood there, frozen, watching in disbelief as the cabinets rattled and the dishes inside shifted. Then, without warning, everything stopped. The door slammed shut, and the house fell silent. I ran out of the kitchen, my pulse racing, and locked myself in the living room. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was in that house, and it wasn't friendly. I stayed up all night, clutching my phone and trying to think of what to do next. The house felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. I considered leaving, but I didn't want to be one of those people who gave up on a place just because it was creepy. I told myself that I was overreacting, that there had to be a rational explanation. But the next morning, I found something that made me question everything. I had gone upstairs to grab some things from the guest room when I noticed something strange on the floor. There was a small, old photo, half hidden under a piece of furniture. I picked it up and froze. It was a picture of the house, exactly as it looked now, but with one disturbing difference. In the window, I could see a figure standing inside. It was a woman, her face obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the silhouette. I had never seen her before. My blood ran cold as I realized that she looked exactly like the figure I had seen out of the corner of my eye in the hallway several nights before. I had to know who she was. I immediately went back to the town library to dig deeper into the house's history. After hours of searching through old records and newspaper clippings, I found the story I had been hoping to avoid. The house had once belonged to a family, Henry and Margaret Eldridge. They had moved there in the 1920s, and from all accounts, they had been a wealthy, well-respected couple in town. But Margaret had disappeared one winter night, and her body was never found. The local authorities suspected foul play, but there was never any concrete evidence. The case went cold, and the house remained abandoned for years. Henry, distraught over his wife's disappearance, had lived there alone until his death. I left the library in a daze, the weight of what I had learned pressing down on me. I was no longer just hearing things or imagining things. There was someone, still in the house, and they had a story to tell. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things and moved out the next day, leaving the landlord a brief note saying I couldn't stay. As I drove away, I took one last look at the house in the rearview mirror. It looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, something I would never be able to explain. Years have passed since I left that house, and I've never been back. But I still can't shake the feeling that Margaret's spirit is still there, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. And every time I pass that stretch of road, I swear I can see her, standing at the window, watching, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was an old farmhouse situated on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you passed by without giving much thought, tucked behind overgrown trees and tall grass. My parents had bought the house when I was 8, looking for a quiet, simple life away from the noise of the city. It seemed like the perfect place. But from the very first day we moved in, I knew something wasn't right. I don't know how to describe it. There wasn't any one thing that gave it away, just a feeling. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting. I had a hard time sleeping, not because of any loud noises or bumps in the night, but because it felt like there was something in the dark, watching, listening. I would lay awake in my small bedroom, staring at the ceiling, heart racing for no reason at all. At first, my parents didn't believe me when I mentioned it. "It's just an old house," my mom would say, trying to reassure me. These old houses have their quirks. But I wasn't talking about creaky floors or drafty windows. I could sense something else, something alive, and it didn't feel friendly. I would hear soft whispers when I was alone, faint but clear enough that I knew they weren't just in my head. Sometimes when I would walk through the halls, I would catch a glimpse of something, a shadow that darted just out of sight, or the sound of footsteps following me, though no one was there. Then there was the attic. I had always been drawn to it, a natural curiosity, though my parents always warned me to stay out of it. The door was old and heavy, with a thick lock on it. My dad explained that it was probably filled with junk from the previous owners, things that no one bothered to throw away. But the lock was always a bit strange to me, like it was meant to keep something in, not out. One evening, when I was about 12, I got the chance to explore the attic. My parents were downstairs, and the house was quiet. I knew I wasn't supposed to be up there, but I couldn't help myself. I grabbed a chair, stood on it, and fiddled with the lock until it came undone. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan, and I stepped inside. It was as dusty as I had expected, with old furniture and boxes strewn about. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. But what caught my attention wasn't the mess. It was the feeling. It was the same sensation I had felt before, like someone was watching me, but stronger, more intense. As I walked deeper into the attic, I noticed something odd. There was a mirror leaning against the far wall. It was tall, with an ornate golden frame, its surface cracked, but still reflecting the dim light. For some reason, I couldn't take my eyes off it. Something about it felt wrong. I approached it slowly, my heart racing, as if the mirror itself was pulling me closer. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something different about it. My face looked slightly off, like the reflection didn't quite match my movements. It was as though the mirror was showing a version of me that wasn't quite real. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement in the background of the reflection. It wasn't me. It was a figure, standing just behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, but no one was there. I looked back at the mirror, and whatever it was had vanished. But I could still feel its presence, the air charged with tension. I ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me, and locked it. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I knew deep down that I had seen something. I had felt something. The next few weeks were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. I would hear soft whispers in the walls, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to ignore them, but it became harder and harder. My parents were busy with work, and they didn't notice my growing unease. It didn't help that my sister, who was a few years younger than me, seemed completely unaffected by the strange atmosphere. She never heard the whispers, never saw the shadows. Then one night, everything changed. I woke up in the middle of the night, a cold sweat on my brow. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through the window. I didn't know why, but I had the strong, overwhelming urge to get up and check the attic. I didn't want to. Part of me knew that something bad had happened up there, something I wasn't supposed to know. But I couldn't resist. I grabbed my flashlight and crept up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the attic door, I felt that familiar pressure in the air, as if something was waiting just beyond the threshold. I hesitated for a moment, but then opened the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness of the night. The attic was colder than usual. I could see my breath in the air as I stepped inside. The mirror was still there, leaning against the wall, but this time something was different. It was no longer reflecting my room. Instead, it showed an image of the attic, as it had looked years ago. Darker, older, with old wooden beams and dust hanging in the air. But the reflection didn't stop there. The figure appeared again, this time clearer than before. A man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face obscured by shadows. He stood in the corner, staring directly at me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The reflection didn't move, it just stood there, waiting. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. I could see the fog of my breath in front of me as I backed away from the mirror, my pulse racing. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the attic with unintelligible voices. I turned and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me and locking it once again. I didn't sleep at all that night. I could hear footsteps pacing up and down the hallway outside my room, but when I opened the door, there was no one there. I felt like I was going insane, like the house was playing tricks on me, warping my mind. But I knew something was wrong. I knew that whatever was in that house was not just a trick of the mind. The next day, I decided to do some research. I went into town asking around about the house and its history. The townspeople were hesitant at first, but eventually one of the older women, Mrs. Jennings, told me about a tragedy that had occurred many years ago. The house had once belonged to a man named William Foster, a recluse who had lived alone with his young daughter. One winter, his daughter had fallen ill, and despite his best efforts, she had died. Grief-stricken and alone, William had become obsessed with the idea that she hadn't truly died, that she was still there, waiting for him. He locked himself in the attic and began to speak to her through the mirror. One night, the neighbors heard a scream from the house. When they arrived, they found William dead, his face frozen in terror. No one ever found out what had happened, but after that, the house was abandoned, left to decay. I couldn't believe it. It explained so much. William's obsession with the mirror, the cold, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. He had never left. That night, I decided to confront whatever was still in the attic. I went up there one last time, standing in front of the mirror. I spoke out loud, though my voice trembled with fear. "I know you're still here," I said, "but you need to leave. You're not welcome anymore." The mirror began to shake, the surface rippling like water. The whispers grew louder, frantic, as if something was trying to break through. But then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. I turned away from the mirror, breathing heavily. The attic felt lighter, the air no longer so oppressive. I left the room, closing the door behind me for good. After that night, the house was different. The whispers stopped, the shadows faded, and the air seemed to clear. I never went back into the attic, but I felt a strange sense of peace. It was as though the house had finally let go of its past, and so had I. We stayed in that farmhouse for another year before moving away, but I'll never forget the feeling that something was always watching, waiting. I'm not sure if William's spirit ever truly left, but whatever it was, I hope it found peace. Story the end.
Story number 11.
I never believed in ghosts. I grew up in a rational household where anything unexplained could be chalked up to imagination, coincidence, or simple science. But all of that changed one fall evening when I moved into an old house on the outskirts of town. The house was charming in its own way, a Victorian-style building with faded brick and an overgrown garden that had seen better days. I had found it on a rental website, and despite its age, I was drawn to it. It felt cozy and, oddly enough, safe. The rent was affordable, and it was exactly the kind of place I needed to get away from the hustle of the city life I had left behind. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Carlson, seemed nice enough, but there was a certain reticence in him whenever I asked too many questions about the house's past. I chalked it up to his age. After all, who wants to dwell on the past when there's rent to be paid? The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking and exploring the house. It had high ceilings and a big staircase leading to the second floor, which gave it a sense of grandeur. But there was something off about it, something subtle that I couldn't quite place. The air always felt cooler than it should, no matter how high I turned up the thermostat. It wasn't until the second week that I first heard it, the faint sound of footsteps coming from above. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the old floorboards creaking under their own weight. But after hearing the same rhythmic steps every night, I started to wonder. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft shuffle, 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 as if someone was pacing the hallway above my bedroom. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight, careful not to wake the neighbors, and crept up the stairs. The floor creaked under my feet as I moved slowly toward the hallway. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw nothing. No signs of movement, no shadows or figures. But the sensation of being watched was palpable, and I quickly turned back, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. The next night, the footsteps returned. I wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but after a few more nights of the same eerie sounds, I felt like I needed to know more. I went back to Mr. Carlson and asked him about the house's history. He looked uneasy, his weathered face tightening when I brought it up. "Some things are better left alone, miss," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's an old house, and like any old place, it carries its stories. Some of them are not for the curious." I wasn't sure what he meant, but his response unnerved me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the house. I started digging through old records at the town library, searching for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. After several hours, I found an article from the 1920s about a family that had once lived in the house. The family was the Larkin family, Thomas and Eleanor Larkin, and their 2 children, a boy and a girl. The article mentioned that Thomas had been a successful businessman, but his life took a tragic turn when his wife, Eleanor, died in a fire in the house. The fire had been ruled an accident, but there were whispers in town that it wasn't. Eleanor had died in the upstairs bedroom, and the children were found alive but traumatized. The article didn't mention what had happened to the children, but the family had left the house shortly after the fire, and it had been sold several times since. There was no mention of Thomas Larkin, and no one seemed to know what had happened to him. The next night, I went to bed feeling uneasy. I didn't want to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but the footsteps were becoming harder to ignore. As I lay in the dark, listening to the usual sounds of the house, I heard something new. A voice. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a soft, mournful whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the sadness in the sound. It was as if the voice was calling to me, beckoning me to listen. Terrified, but unable to ignore it, I got up and followed the sound, flashlight in hand. The voice seemed to be coming from the 2nd floor, from the hallway where the footsteps always started. I walked slowly, carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top of the stairs, I felt an ice-cold draft, the temperature in the hallway suddenly dropping several degrees. The voice was now clearer, more distinct. It was a woman's voice. "Help me," the voice whispered, barely audible, but unmistakable. I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and run, but I didn't. I stepped forward, my hand shaking as I reached the door to the master bedroom. It was closed, just as it had always been. I hesitated, then slowly pushed it open. The room was empty, save for the old furniture covered in dust. But as I stepped inside, I felt something shift in the air. The temperature was frigid, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I walked to the window, where a dim moonlight cast long shadows across the room. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the window, I saw a figure standing behind me. A woman, her form faint and ethereal, with long dark hair and a pale face. She wore an old-fashioned dress, the kind that women wore in the late 1800s. I turned around in a panic, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I had seen something, someone standing in the room with me. But when I looked again, there was nothing. No woman, no figure, just the empty room and the eerie silence. I left the house the next morning, unable to sleep after that encounter. I went to Mr. Carlson and told him everything that had happened. His face grew pale, and for the first time I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "She's still here," he whispered. Eleanor, he told me that Eleanor Larkin had never truly left the house after the fire. They say her spirit remained trapped in the room where she died, calling out for help, unable to move on. The footsteps, the whispers, it was all Eleanor, trying to communicate, trying to make sense of what had happened. Some believe she had died in the fire because her husband had locked her in the room, either by accident or on purpose. The tragedy was so great, it had left a mark on the house, a mark that could never be erased. Mr. Carlson told me he had rented the house out several times over the years, but no one ever stayed long. The strange occurrences, the eerie feelings, they drove people away. But despite all of it, he refused to sell the house. It had been in his family for generations, and he wasn't ready to part with it, even if it meant dealing with the spirit of Eleanor Larkin. I never returned to the house after that night. I moved into an apartment in the city, away from the haunting memories of the old place. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the soft whisper of Eleanor's voice, calling from the darkness, asking for help. And I can't help but wonder if her spirit will ever be at peace. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The house was a small, modest cottage tucked on the edge of a sleepy town. Its walls were a faded blue, and the porch sagged slightly in the middle, giving it a quiet, worn charm. My grandmother had lived there for as long as I could remember. I'd spent countless summers there, the scent of her old books and lavender always filling the air. There was a peacefulness to the house, but as a child, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was something unspoken, like a secret that lingered in the shadows, too faint for anyone to address directly. I never thought much of it until that one summer when I was 16 and my grandmother passed away. It happened unexpectedly, a stroke that took her in a matter of days. We'd all gathered at her house for the funeral, and the atmosphere was thick with grief. My family was busy with the preparations, and I found myself alone in the house more than I liked. As much as I loved the old place, being there without her was different. It felt colder somehow, as though the warmth had left with her. It was on the third night after her death that I experienced something that would change everything. I had stayed up later than usual, unable to sleep, wandering through the quiet house. I passed through the living room where my grandmother's old rocking chair still sat, its wooden frame worn smooth from years of use. The chair, which had always creaked gently when she rocked in it, was still. But that night, something was off. I stood in the doorway, staring at it. The room was dark except for the faint moonlight streaming through the window, and the chair sat motionless in the shadows. Then, to my horror, it moved. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the house shifting in the quiet of the night. But the movement wasn't gentle or caused by any draft. The chair rocked back and forth, slowly, rhythmically, as if someone were sitting in it, pushing it gently with their feet. I took a step into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. "Grandma?" I whispered, my voice trembling, half hoping she'd be there, sitting in her chair as she had always done. But the room was empty. The chair continued to rock, the sound of its creaking filling the silence. I couldn't explain it. My mind raced through all the logical explanations, but none of them made sense. It was as though something, or someone, was in the room with me. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. A coldness like a draft brushed against my skin. I couldn't take it any longer. I ran out of the room, my heart racing, and locked myself in my bedroom. I didn't sleep that night, too frightened to even close my eyes. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened, but they just shrugged it off. It's just the old house settling, my dad said, and you're probably just missing your grandmother. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew what I had felt, what I had seen, wasn't just my imagination. Over the next few days, the house seemed to grow even colder. Every night, I would hear the soft creaking of the rocking chair, always around midnight. The sound would echo through the halls, and I would lie in bed, too terrified to move, my body frozen with fear. But the strange occurrences didn't stop there. One afternoon, while I was going through my grandmother's things in the attic, I found an old, dusty box tucked away in a corner. Inside, there were photos, letters, and a few trinkets, things my grandmother had kept from her youth. Among the items was a small wooden box, intricately carved with delicate patterns. It seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong with the other mementos. I picked it up, curious, and tried to open it. The lid didn't budge at first, but after a bit of effort, I managed to pry it open. Inside was a faded photograph of a man and a woman. The man had a stern expression, and the woman was smiling, holding a baby in her arms. The woman looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. There was something haunting about the image, though, like the woman's eyes followed me, even though she was long gone. I turned the photo over and read the faint writing on the back. "To my dearest Rose, forever yours, Thomas." I had never heard of anyone named Thomas. My grandmother's name was Margaret, and she had never mentioned a Rose or a Thomas to me. I stared at the photo, feeling a strange sense of unease settle in my chest. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept hearing whispers, just barely audible, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. It was as though someone was standing just beyond my reach, waiting for me to listen. And then, once again, I heard the soft creaking of the rocking chair. I had to know more. I couldn't ignore the strange connection between the photo and the noises anymore. I went downstairs to the library, pulling out old family records, journals, and anything I could find. Hours passed as I sifted through yellowed papers, but then Buried in the back of a drawer, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a letter, handwritten by my grandmother. The ink was faded and the paper was brittle, but I could still make out the words. It was addressed to a man named Thomas. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I never wanted to hurt you. I had no choice. Please forgive me." I stared at the letter, my mind racing. What did this mean? Why had my grandmother kept this letter all these years? I had never heard her speak of anyone named Thomas. I kept reading, and as I did, a cold chill crept up my spine. The letter described a love affair my grandmother had had when she was young. Thomas, it seemed, was a man she had loved before she married my grandfather. But the letter spoke of a tragedy, something dark that had happened between them, something my grandmother had never spoken about. The details were vague, but it was clear that the relationship had ended badly. The final lines of the letter sent a wave of dread through me. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I couldn't let him go. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I will always love you. Please, if you come back, know that I never wanted to hurt you." I closed the letter and sat back, my mind reeling. Could this Thomas be the same man in the photograph? And what did all of this have to do with the rocking chair? The next night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the creaking of the chair. This time, though, it wasn't just the chair moving. I could hear a soft whisper, faint but unmistakable. It was a voice, a man's voice. "Rose, come back to me." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was filled with longing, like it had been calling for years, waiting for my grandmother to return. I jumped out of bed, my mind racing. I grabbed the photograph from the attic and rushed down to the living room. The rocking chair was moving again, slowly, rhythmically, back and forth, as if someone were sitting there, waiting. And then I saw it. The reflection in the window behind the chair, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching me. I turned to look, but there was no one there. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. The voice, faint and distant, called again, this time more urgent. "Rose, don't leave me." I ran out of the house that night, not looking back. I didn't return to the cottage for weeks. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for certain. My grandmother had kept a secret. And whatever it was still in that house. When I finally returned, the house felt different. The rocking chair was still there, but it was no longer moving. The air was lighter, less oppressive. I never heard the whispers again, and the strange presence that had filled the house seemed to fade away. I never spoke about what happened, not to my parents or anyone else. I don't know if anyone else ever experienced the strange events that I did, but I always felt that my grandmother's past was never truly put to rest. I like to think that Thomas finally found peace, and that my grandmother's love for him was what kept him tied to the house. But I'll never forget that summer, or the feeling of being watched, of something old and sorrowful lingering just beyond my reach. It was as if the house itself had carried the weight of a forgotten love story, one that refused to be silenced. Story the end.
Story number 13.
I didn't believe in ghosts. In fact, I had always prided myself on being a pragmatic, no-nonsense person. But what happened to me when I moved into the old house on Ashford Road forever changed my view on the paranormal. It was a quiet little town, one of those places where everyone knows everyone's business, and the streets are lined with old, creaky houses. I had just gotten a new job in town, and wanting a fresh start, I found a small, affordable cottage on the edge of Ashford Road. The place was charming, a Victorian-style home with ivy crawling up the sides and a garden that seemed to have been neglected for years. The landlord, Mrs. Thornton, was an older woman with a gentle smile, and she assured me that the house was in good condition despite its age. She mentioned that it had been in her family for generations, but didn't go into any more detail. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time unpacking and settling in, enjoying the serenity of the area. There was an old fireplace in the living room that I quickly became fond of, and the high ceilings and hardwood floors made the house feel spacious. But as the days passed, I started noticing strange things. At night, I would hear faint noises coming from upstairs, soft creaks and muffled footsteps. I tried to brush it off as the house settling, but it became hard to ignore when the sounds happened consistently every night at the same time, just after midnight. I'd lay in bed, eyes wide open, straining to hear the slightest sound. There was no mistaking it. The footsteps were real. I would wait for them to stop, but they would continue for what felt like an eternity before fading into silence. One evening, unable to ignore it any longer, I decided to investigate. I had heard enough stories from friends and family over the years about old houses and their creaks, but something about this felt different. With a flashlight in hand, I climbed the stairs and stood in the darkened hallway. The sound of footsteps was unmistakable, but there was no one there. I slowly moved toward the guest bedroom, where the sounds seemed to be coming from, but again, nothing. The room was empty. Just the faint scent of dust and old wood lingered in the air. I figured I was just being paranoid, my mind playing tricks on me. I went back to bed, but the noises continued each night, like a constant companion. The whispering started next. Soft, unintelligible whispers that I could almost hear in the corners of the house, just out of my reach. I would stand still, listening, but it was always just beyond my hearing, like the sound was slipping through my fingers. Then came the cold spots. In the middle of the night, the temperature in certain areas of the house would suddenly drop. I would be sitting in the living room with a blanket wrapped around me, only to feel a chill sweep through the room. It wasn't the kind of cold you get from an open window or a draft. It was deeper, more unsettling, like the air had been drained of warmth. The most unsettling part, though, was the feeling of being watched. No matter where I went in the house, I couldn't shake the sense that I was not alone. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows flitting across rooms, or something that almost seemed to be standing just out of sight. I would turn, but there was never anything there. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head. Maybe the house had an old, creaky heating system, or maybe the wind played tricks on me. But every night, the noises grew louder, the cold spots more frequent, and the feeling of being watched more intense. Then came the night I couldn't deny it any longer. I had come home late from work, tired and drained from a long day. As I stepped into the house, I immediately felt that familiar chill. But this time, something was different. The whispers were louder, more distinct, and they seemed to be coming from the stairwell. My heart began to race as I moved toward the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stood there, frozen in place. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping sound. It was as if someone, was pacing back and forth upstairs. I could feel my breath quicken, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I knew I should leave, get in my car, and drive far away, but I was rooted to the spot. The thumping grew louder, closer, until I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed the nearest object, my keys, and made my way up the stairs. The temperature had dropped significantly by this point, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. As I reached the top of the stairs, the thumping stopped. For a moment, everything was completely still. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, a woman. Her back was turned to me, but I could see her clearly in the dim light. She wore a long, dark dress that brushed the floor, and her hair hung loosely around her shoulders. She seemed almost transparent, the details of her form fading in and out like she was made of smoke. I froze, unable to move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by stress? But then, the woman slowly turned around, and I saw her face. Her features were pale, almost ashen, and her eyes were wide, staring directly at me. I could feel a chill in the air, as though her gaze was freezing me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by her stare. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. One moment she was standing there, and the next she was gone, leaving nothing but the faint smell of roses and an overwhelming sense of dread in the air. I stumbled back, my legs weak, and I rushed downstairs to the front door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. I didn't look back as I ran out of the house and into the cold night air. I spent the night in my car, too afraid to return. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to go back inside, so I called Mrs. Thornton. I told her I was moving out, that I couldn't stay there any longer. She didn't ask any questions, but I could hear the sorrow in her voice. She told me that the house had always been like that the woman who haunted it had been a part of the family for generations. She was, Mrs. Thornton said, the ghost of her great-grandmother, who had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. Apparently, the family had tried to sell the house many times over the years, but no one ever lasted long. It was always the same story: strange noises, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Mrs. Thornton had hoped that the house would find a new owner who could live with its history, but she had to accept that it was too much for me. As I left that town behind, I couldn't shake the feeling of that woman's eyes on me. It wasn't just the fear, it was a deep, unshakable sadness. I've never gone back to that house, and I never will. But sometimes late at night, I can still hear the faint whisper of footsteps, the soft creaking of the old floorboards, and I wonder if that woman is still watching, waiting for someone to understand her story. Story the end.
Story number 14.
I had always been skeptical of ghost stories. I was the kind of person who dismissed anything supernatural as coincidence or imagination. But that all changed one late summer evening when I moved into the old house on Elm Street. The house had been on the market for months, and when I saw it, I knew it was perfect. The price was low and the space was exactly what I needed: a quiet retreat from the chaos of city life. What I didn't know was that the house had a history that I would soon come to regret not asking about. The house itself was an old Victorian, the kind you imagine when you think of creepy, abandoned buildings. It had an overgrown garden, crooked windows, and an attic that had probably been untouched for decades. There was an unsettling charm to it, though, and despite the heavy feeling in the air when I first walked through the door, I ignored my gut and moved in. The first few nights were peaceful. The house was quiet, and the creaking of the floorboards seemed to settle into a rhythm. I began to enjoy the solitude. But after a week, things started to change. I first noticed the strange occurrences when I began hearing footsteps at night. Soft, deliberate steps that echoed from the hallway upstairs. At first, I thought it was the house settling, the way old homes do. But as the days passed, the footsteps became more distinct. They always started just after midnight, right when the house had fallen silent, and they always came from the same direction, above my bedroom. It wasn't the kind of noise you hear from wind or old pipes. These were heavy, measured steps, as if someone was walking back and forth in the hallway. It felt real, and more than that, it felt intentional, as though whoever or whatever was upstairs knew exactly where I was and was trying to get my attention. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. I had moved into a new environment, after all. But every night, the footsteps continued. I began to dread going to sleep, knowing that I would lie awake listening to them, growing louder and closer until they stopped abruptly at the edge of my door. I didn't tell anyone at first. I didn't want to seem paranoid, especially since I couldn't explain what was happening. But one night, the sound was so vivid, so real, that I couldn't ignore it. The footsteps were louder than ever, and this time, they didn't stop at my door. They moved closer. I could hear them pacing right outside my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear. The door to my room creaked, and my heart nearly stopped. Slowly, inch by inch, the door began to open. I froze, unable to move. I kept my eyes locked on the shadowy gap that was widening. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but I knew deep down that there was no logical reason for what was happening. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, making me jump so hard I nearly fell out of bed. I sat there in the dark, trembling, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. After a few moments, I heard the footsteps again. Only this time, they were fading, walking down the hallway and disappearing into the distance. I didn't sleep that night, and the next day, I called my friend Rachel, who had always been open-minded about things like this. She didn't laugh or diss me. Instead, she listened intently, and after a long pause, she told me I should do some research on the house. "You might be living in a haunted place," she said. I was hesitant, but that evening I did exactly what she suggested. I spent hours combing through online records and old newspapers, searching for anything that might explain the strange events. What I found chilled me to the bone. The house had once belonged to a family named the Langfords. According to a newspaper article from the early 1900s, the family had been found dead under mysterious circumstances. The father, Richard Langford, had reportedly gone mad after the tragic deaths of his wife, Elizabeth, and their two children, Lily and Thomas. It was said that Richard had locked himself away in the attic, where he was eventually found alone and disoriented. The authorities never discovered how Elizabeth and the children had died, but there were rumors of violence and a tragedy that had remained a closely guarded secret. The article mentioned that after the deaths, the house had been sold multiple times, but no one stayed for long. The previous tenants all reported strange noises, cold spots, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Eventually, the house had fallen into disrepair, and it had sat vacant for years before I found it. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The footsteps, the cold spots, the door that slammed shut on its own. Suddenly, it all made sense, but it didn't make it any less terrifying. That night, I sat in the living room, too afraid to go upstairs. I kept hearing small noises, things shifting, moving. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but it felt like the house was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. And then, just as I had feared, the footsteps began again. This time, they were more deliberate, more forceful. They weren't soft, hesitant sounds like before. They were quick, purposeful steps, moving across the floor above my head. I was too terrified to even move, too frozen in place to act. The steps seemed to follow me as I paced around the downstairs, moving in rhythm with my every step. It was as if someone or something was trying to match my movements. The door to the basement creaked open, though I hadn't touched it. I knew it led down to a dark, unfinished room, but something about it beckoned me. Against every instinct, I slowly made my way toward it, drawn by an unseen force. As I stepped down into the basement, the temperature dropped. My breath clouded in front of me, and I could feel the presence of something that had been waiting for me. I turned on the light, and that's when I saw it. There on the far wall was a large, old portrait. The people in the portrait were unmistakable, the Langford family. Their faces, though faded with age, were hauntingly familiar. Richard Langford's eyes were hollow, like he was staring straight through me. I shuddered and backed away, feeling the air grow heavier around me. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. It was the unmistakable sound of someone walking up the stairs from the basement. I spun around, my heart racing, but when I looked, there was no one there. The footsteps stopped. I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me, and bolted into the living room. I didn't sleep at all that night, and the next morning I called Rachel again. "I can't do this anymore," I told her. "I have to leave. I can't stay here." I didn't wait another night. I packed my things in a rush, abandoning the house and everything I had planned for. I didn't know where I would go, but I knew I couldn't stay. The house had won. Years later, I still think about it. I wonder if anyone else has dared to live there, or if the house still waits for its next tenant, luring them in with its quiet charm. But what I know for sure is that the house on Elm Street wasn't just old, it was haunted. And I was lucky to escape with my sanity intact. Story the end.